All right, it's so good to have you back here. It is episode 9 of Tom Jordan Live here on a Thursday. I hope you're having a great one. It's a good morning, and it's Tom Jordan. Got a lot of headlines to get into before we get to our guest today. It's going to be Joel Griffith with the Heritage Foundation. Is going to join me in just a few moments to compare and contrast the economic plans of former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris. Which one is better? Free market principles or, things like deregulation, that's good, and lower taxes, or maybe price controls and rent caps and more regulations and increasing taxes. And what about tariffs? Are they an effective sales tax, as Kamala Harris claims they are? What's the best way to actually reduce the cost of living? We will dive into that and a whole lot more in just a few moments. But first, a reminder to subscribe to Tom Jordan Live and share this content to whomever that you see fit. Also, I'll be taking your comments and your questions later in the program. Just contribute in the comments section on whichever platform you are viewing us, whether it's Facebook or YouTube, X, Spotify, wherever you are. We are watching your questions and comments, and we'll have them in just a moment. All right, some headlines first to get to. We want to talk about this Israel-Hezbollah war, and tensions have really flared up between Israel and Hezbollah, leading to multiple rocket attacks from Lebanon into northern Israel. The Israeli Defense Forces, they reported more than 10 rockets launched just in the past couple of hours or so into Israel, targeting these areas like Safed and Kiryat Shmona. Most of these rockets were intercepted, thankfully, by Israeli air defenses, and thankfully no injuries have been reported. So the U.S. Department of Defense has clarified that it is not providing intelligence or direct military support to Israel for these operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon. But the U.S. government does say they are actively engaged in diplomatic efforts to de-escalate the situation. They want a ceasefire involving Israel's defense against these extremist terrorist groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, of course, both of them backed and supported by the largest supporter of terrorism, and that'll be the country of Iran. Israeli airstrikes have been targeting Hezbollah, the infrastructure. Hezbollah continues to launch rockets into Israel. The whole conflict here is escalating more and more. And additionally, this is interesting, the Mossad, which is Israel's intelligence organization, they say they have prevented more than 50 Iran-backed terrorist attacks against Jews and Israelis across the world since October the 7th. A huge increase in Iran's efforts to target Israelis and Jews abroad. All right, this was breaking news yesterday. I want to give you an update on New York City Mayor Eric Adams. He's been indicted amid this campaign corruption probe. New York City Mayor Eric Adams indicted following this lengthy federal investigation into campaign corruption. The indictment, confirmed by multiple sources, comes after months of scrutiny and raids on key members of the mayor's administration, including top aides Winnie Greco and Brianna Suggs. And while the charges against Adams remain under seal, we don't know what they are exactly. They are expected to be unsealed as early as tomorrow, possibly today. Eric Adams has responded to the indictment with defiance. He says this, quote, "I always knew that if I stood my ground for New Yorkers, I would become a target." He said that in a statement. He said, "If I am charged, I am innocent, and I will fight this with every ounce of my strength and spirit." So this has been going on for several months now, for the majority of this year. A lot of political figures involved in this. So we're watching. That will bring you updates as they come in. Have you tried to search on Google about Donald Trump or Kamala Harris? Google search, there is a bias there, and the study reveals favoritism towards Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. A new study from the Media Research Center, known as MRC, reveals that Google's search engine results favor Vice President Kamala Harris over former President Donald Trump, especially when it comes to campaign website placement. So the study was conducted on September the 6th. It compared searches for Donald Trump, presidential race 2024, in Kamala Harris presidential race 2024, and it found that Harris's campaign website appeared third overall in the organic search results, while Donald Trump's website ranked well below it, behind also multiple left-leaning media articles. I've tested this out myself, and it is absolutely the case. And the MRC founder, Brent Bozell, he called out Google for stacking the deck in favor of Kamala Harris, saying that, the tech giant promotes leftist bias by displaying these articles that praise Kamala Harris and pretty critical of Donald Trump. And so the study does underscore what we talked about, all these concerns about media manipulation and biased coverage as the 2024 election approaches. A little news on some power rankings as we're getting close to the election. Republicans are on track to seize control of the Senate with 51 seats. This is a significant shift with 51 seats, that is, as Montana leans GOP. Businessman and former Navy SEAL Tim Sheehy is leading the charge in Montana against longtime Democratic Senator John Tester. He's a Democrat in a pretty red state, and the swing could pave the way for Republicans to flip the Senate, which would be a pretty huge victory, of course, for the Republican Party. Meantime, Vice President Kamala Harris, she is enjoying a small post-debate bump, kind of tightening the race with former President Donald Trump. Though independents are now favoring Kamala Harris, the race remains really too close to call. Donald Trump holds strong support among his base, but with Kamala Harris up by 2 points in some of these key polls, the election could mirror the tight margins of 2020. The House of Representatives also remains a battleground with several races emerging as toss-ups, and the GOP has lost ground in some governor races as well. Some news out of the Trump assassination attempt. Shocking revelations from the Senate report on the Secret Service handling of the Trump assassination attempt. A new Senate report reveals startling details about the Secret Service's mishandling of the first assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump during that 2024 campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. There is a series of security lapses that were contributing to the near tragedy. It was a tragedy because someone was killed in this. Donald Trump was grazed in the ear by a bullet. But some of these lapses include technical issues with the agency's drone detection system and a lot of poor communication among the agents. And one of the most troubling points was this inexperienced agent, unfamiliar with the drone detection equipment. He was on the phone with customer support as the threat unfolded, trying to figure out how to use the drone. And in addition, there was a sniper team leader failed to use real-time radio communications to let the other agents know about what he was witnessing from the rooftop, that all of a sudden these cops had drawn their guns, were running towards a potential target, and he just decided to keep that to himself, said he didn't really think about letting the other members of the Secret Service know about that. So the errors apparently allowed this would-be assassin to get dangerously close to the rally without the proper intervention. And so a lot of concern about what's happening in the Secret Service. All right, back to some of our economic policies that we wanted to get into. Yesterday, Kamala Harris talked about her holistic approach to the economy. And Donald Trump spoke earlier this week about his free market approach. What are the economic policies of the current presidential candidates, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris? They both insist that their plans are the plans that will benefit average Americans, the middle class, and it will stir innovation and yield prosperity for working families and such, all that kind of rhetoric from both sides of this. And here's the thing, they both have a track record with which to compare. So the Donald Trump presidency, despite claims from his predecessor, Barack Obama, that manufacturing was essentially over and that there was no more hope for drilling, for lower gas prices and all that, Donald Trump proved that those things, what Barack Obama said, were wrong. Those things still work. His economic policies are what led to the return of manufacturing to the United States, record low unemployment during his time in office, dramatically lower energy prices, an influx of new startups, and higher wages for all demographics, including minority groups. Under Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, there was high inflation rates that we haven't seen in decades. Wages not keeping pace even still today. It's about 3% lower than the annual rate of inflation. There's higher rents, higher mortgages, higher interest rates, higher cost of food, slimmer margins for farmers, large numbers of layoffs in the private sector, et cetera. So both administrations can claim a pretty strong market, though. This is what's interesting about this. This is why you see a lot of economists say, well, the economy is really strong because, Wall Street is faring well. And it has in both administrations. But how that market prosperity trickled down to the average Americans was dramatically different in both administrations. So here are some of the Trump ideas for the economy. We'll get into this with Joel Griffith in a moment with the Heritage Foundation. He wants to expand the tax cuts that he put into place in 2017. And the Trump campaign is really advocating for keeping the lower individual income tax rates lower. And the extension would preserve lower tax brackets and a higher tax standard deduction, which I liked. I'm like the definition of middle class, and it definitely benefited me in my family, as I'm sure it did yours. The top income tax rate held at 37%. Under Trump's plan, the top rate would remain at 37%, still significantly lower than the pre-tax reduction rate of 39.6%. So the idea is to incentivize investment and economic growth. He wants to keep the child tax credit at $2,000 and up to $1,400 of that refundable under the proposal. Also, the permanent corporate tax rate, and this is really important, reduce that to 15%. So Donald Trump's plan includes lowering that corporate tax rate to 15%, which would further reduce the cost of doing business in the United States, make it more competitive, bring maybe more manufacturers from overseas. And then this 10% across-the-board tariff on imports, which is controversial. And Joel Griffith is going to talk about that as well. He's written about it. So Kamala Harris, she came out yesterday, talked about her holistic approach to the economy. She would expand the existing benefits for low and middle income households. She would create new subsidies to support home ownership. The cost of all these benefit expansions would be partially offset by raising taxes. She wants to support first-time home buyers who can't afford a home by giving them a $25,000 down payment, a $25,000 subsidy for first-time home buyers assistance. That would be nice. Most of us have never gotten any of that. But what would that do? Well, you'd have to raise the corporate tax rate to pay for all these things. Raising the corporate income tax rate from 21% to 28%. You'd roll back all these Trump-era tax cuts. And in large part, that would happen in order to support all these social programs that she wants to implement, including potentially making the Affordable Care Act really the way to go by raising taxes to help support that. All right. With what we know, whose plan is better for you and me? I mean, I can rattle off numbers, but, I'm not an economist. But Joel Griffith knows a lot about the economy. He's a research fellow in the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Hey, Joel, it's really nice to have you. I appreciate your time. Thanks for your patience in getting the program. I had a few technical difficulties at first, but really glad that you're with us.
Oh, yeah. Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
You got it. Yeah, thanks so much. Well, I mean, generally speaking, I know that Kamala Harris came out yesterday and she talked about her holistic approach to the economy. And to me, it sounds like more subsidy driven. She wasn't real specific like we thought she was going to be. But your general takeaway, just generally speaking, then we'll get more into the nitty gritty between the Donald Trump approach to the economy and the Kamala Harris approach to the economy.
Well, Kamala Harris's approach is very troubling. And if you look at just the tax plan in and of itself, calls to implement a wealth tax to increase the top rate on income earners and entrepreneurs to close to 40%. We know that this will deter investment. And without investment dollars, none of us, even if we're just middle class, none of us are able to become more productive. And the only way that you can increase middle class prosperity is if the typical worker can actually produce more. And when you penalize people for succeeding, and when you actually take away the capital that they would otherwise invest in research and development and technologies, well, that means over time, our productivity is going to increase at a slower rate. And that will be a drag on productivity. And look, in a time when both Republicans and Democrats continue to spend more than we're bringing in, we have to have increases in productivity just to counter the inflationary impact of that, because the government's robbing us each year from some of the benefits of our productivity gains. And unfortunately, that the tax plan she's proposed is going to greatly diminish the amount of money available for those investment projects.
Well, that seems to be really at the heart of the matter when you talk about increasing productivity. What leads to an increase in productivity and in incentivizing more investment? It certainly isn't more taxes. But I just saw another commercial this morning from Kamala Harris, a supporter of Kamala Harris, and it was I think, a teacher saying, it's absurd that I had to pay more in taxes than billionaires pay in taxes. And I find that so nauseating to hear over, time and time again, because it's just, in my view, it's simply not true. I mean, am I correct in saying that the vast majority of taxes in this country
It,
are paid
it
for by
simply
the
is.
very wealthiest people in this country?
Absolutely. Number one, the tax rates on the wealthy, of course, are far higher than those in the lower income strata. Close to half of all Americans actually don't pay income tax right now. Once you figure in all of the rebates and tax credits. But number two, the proportion of the taxes paid by the wealthy are far higher, meaning that a higher proportion of their income ends up being siphoned off to the federal government than those at the bottom of the spectrum.
Yeah, so just touch on this because I think there's a misunderstanding of what these people mean when they say billionaires aren't paying their share in taxes. This has to do with income taxes. And if you're no longer working, like you're no longer taking an income from a job, do you still have to pay taxes? I think this is what they're not understanding, is that there's a difference between, taking in retirement or your investments and living off your investments that you've earned maybe on the stock market for 40 years and finally stopping, taking a salary versus taking a salary and paying no taxes. So this has to do with the investments that you've made. You're 60 years old. You happen to be a billionaire. You stop working, and now you're living off the investments that you made. Is that what they're trying to equate? Is the same thing as an income tax?
Well, perhaps it's in reference to the fact that their capital gains taxes are taxed at a lower level than income taxes. If you're
Correct.
making ordinary income, you can be taxed up to around 39% of your W 2 income gets taxed. If you put money into an investment project and you're able to realize gains after a year or more, typically those taxes are closer to 15%, far lower than ordinary income. What the tax code is recognizing is something very important. The reason why we tax investment income at a lower rate than ordinary income is there's a recognition that we want to incentivize investment, because when you as an investor put money into a project, yes, you might profit. Hopefully you will. But it's not just you that are you that's benefiting. You end up benefiting the entire economy. You benefit the employees that you hire, the community that you're in. And so we want to incentivize people refraining from using their income to just purchase a new yacht or purchase clothes. We want to incentivize people to actually delay gratification, put their money in investments, whether it's starting a business or whether it's as an individual, putting money into the stock market. We want to incentivize that because that's what generates long-term real growth.
Well, since we're on this topic right now, I was going to wait a little bit later to bring this up, but there is a plan by Kamala Harris, and Joe Biden had supported this. A lot of Democrats had supported, taxes on unrealized gains, meaning that if you invest in stocks and you're not planning to touch that investment for another 20 years, you can still be taxed on something that you're not taking in at this current time, and whatever your investment is. So unrealized gains, maybe your stock value has gone up, something you're not seeing, but you're still going to be taxed on that. Why is that either a good or a bad plan, and what are the ramifications of taxing unrealized gains?
Well, let's talk about first whether or not the government even has the power to do this, and then they don't. The
Yeah.
Constitution very clearly delineates in which manners of taxation the federal government can engage in. We know that there's an income tax allowed. We passed a constitutional amendment, and the government also has the power to levy import duties and export duties. I don't think those are beneficial, but it does have the power to do so. And if the government wanted to do a per person tax equally applied to everybody, they could do that as well. And then lastly, the federal government has the power to actually tax specific transactions, such as when a piece of property transfers from one person to another person, or even upon death. Once again, we can argue about whether or not those taxes are beneficial. I don't believe they are, but the government has the power to do that. Levying a property tax or levying a tax on a gain that is not yet realized is not something the government has the power to do. And even if they did, it would be very harmful. And that would be because think about if you've got a portfolio that goes from of stock from $10,000 to $15,000. On paper, you've got a gain of $5,000. Imagine being able to go ahead and just tax you on that paper gain of 5,000. Most people would find it necessary to actually cash out part of that investment. That'll put downward pressure on the price of that, and you'd actually end up seeing our country consume that capital base that we need to produce more. So it would be economically destructive. And any time that you transfer a piece of capital from an investor to the government, that capital is gone. The government spends that capital in year one, and it's no longer there to produce more wealth.
This is all it's seeming to me like, I think that you just talk about the death tax or the estate tax or however you want to call it. When somebody dies, Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, their approach on how to tax the estate of someone who has passed away and the importance of, generational wealth. Kamala Harris, and she's not very specific in her current policies right now, but she has made statements in the past on a number of occasions about taxing generational wealth because she doesn't believe that it's equitable in terms of one family allowing their offspring to start at a better place than maybe somebody else. So the idea basically is that you tax those wealthy families when the parents die off, and rather than giving the passing that on to the kids, the offspring, taxing it at a high rate, grabbing it, and ostensibly giving that to someone who doesn't have a family that did well. This is the estate tax, the death tax. What does that end up doing, do you think? And what's the real goal behind positing such an idea?
Yeah, well, first, when it comes to the estate tax, this is more than just an economic matter. It's a matter of morality. Do we believe that it is right for a government to confiscate the wealth of an individual after they die, rather than allow that person to pass that along to an heir, to whomever they choose? And this is a basic matter of morality, to think that the heavy-handed government can just come in and seize everything you've worked for your entire life, rather than allow you to direct that to something to fulfill your own wishes. It's immoral, but it's also economically harmful. And that's because many people have the incentive of actually working hard to pass along an estate to somebody else, and incentivizes them to actually save rather than to spend. It incentivizes them to continue to manage their finances well beyond the point in which they personally need to do so. It's a matter of pride and a matter of caring for the next generation. If we take away the capacity of people to actually pass along that wealth to their heirs, there's going to be more of an incentive for people to actually just consume what they have actually earned rather than to pass it along. And this also goes back to what we talked about a session ago with the wealth tax in general. When you transfer wealth from a person, whether during their life or after the life, to the government, that capital dissipates. It is spent in year one. It's like killing the goose that's laying the golden eggs. We can argue about whether or not the government should be taking any of those eggs, but the bottom line is, if you want to have this big social welfare safety net, the last thing you should be doing is slaughtering the goose, because there will be no more golden eggs. I mean, look at Venezuela, Cuba, the former Soviet Union. So this is destructive. And something else on this estate tax that the left is wanting to do, and that candidate Harris has expressed support for in the past, is, right now, when you pass along your estate to someone else upon death, you get what's called a stepped up basis in that asset. So if I buy a stock at $5,000, I pass it along to an heir, that stock is worth $10,000. If they now sell that stock, they're not going to pay a capital gains tax on that $5,000 gain, because when they receive it, they get to go ahead and record it as if they paid $10,000 for it. What the left now wants to do is eliminate that stepped up basis, meaning, let's say I've got a house that I bought at $200,000. It's now worth $400,000. I die. I pass it along to my son. Guess what? They now have to go ahead and act and pay as if they already have a $200,000 gain on that property. It's just another mechanism that the government is getting involved in, really taking away the wealth that somebody's worked so hard to acquire.
Yes, and I don't understand why so many people support these types of things because to me, it's like the government's going to come in, they're going to take all your wealth, and then they're going to go, like you said, spend it all in year one on what? They're wasting. I mean, they just left $90 billion worth of military equipment and they gave that to the Taliban. Do you really trust that the government knows how to spend your money better than you do? And a lot of us who have kids, a lot of our working life, 30, 40 years of work is part of the goal is to leave something for our own children to make their lives better. So the government takes it and then they spend it willy-nilly on whatever they seem to be fit. And this is not something I don't think most Americans, I think, truly would support if they understood what the whole crux of this issue is. I want to talk about the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that Donald Trump put in. He wants to extend that, but he put this in originally in 2017. And it allowed just normal taxpayers to have a much greater deduction, and it saved a lot of people a lot of money. I mentioned earlier, I'm like the definition of middle class. And my wife and I were thrilled about these tax cuts, but we keep hearing over and over again that those tax cuts only benefited the wealthy and the millionaires and the billionaires. He wants to extend it. Kamala Harris would like for it to go away for some reason and then just raise it on the corporations. What's the reality about this, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and how are most people benefiting from it?
Well, the reality is number one, every income level benefited from these tax cuts. The second reality is that those at the bottom of the income scale actually saw a bigger benefit proportional to their income. But number three, I think even more important, is that it made our business tax code far more competitive. We're still, even at that 20 where we're at now with the business tax rate, we are still higher than a lot of our competitors, but at least we're more competitive. If we allow that corporate tax rate to increase to what the current Democrat candidate is calling for, our corporate tax rate, business tax rate, would actually be higher that of communist China. It'd be higher that of the former socialist Nordic countries like Sweden, Denmark, Norway. Not number two, if we allow these tax cuts to expire, you also see that top bracket on the $400,000 plus level increase to close to 40%. For those in places like California and New York, that means half of your income would go to the government. And we know for a fact that it's usually people in that upper middle class income range that have been the ones that have been more likely or to have successful small businesses. So they're basically their income, if they're an LLC, they're taxed as if it's ordinary income. So we're seeing these massive tax hikes would deter investment and really undo a lot of the progress that was made back in 2017.
Yeah, and also increases the cost of living for everyday Americans. And I want to that point, I want to talk about the cost of groceries because I know you've written about this as well. And Kamala Harris, vice president and the presidential candidate, she claims that there are bad actors in the grocery industry and the food industry, and that they are the ones responsible for the high grocery prices. So she's coming in and she wants to have price controls on food, on groceries. And I look at the grocery industry in general, their margins are incredibly slim right now. It doesn't seem there's a lot of price gouging going on there. But if this is successful, and I don't think it will be because it has to go through Congress in order for that to happen, unless she does some type of executive order to do this. But the whole larger picture of price controls, when a government comes in and does that kind of thing, what are the ramifications of that? What are some of the consequences?
Well, we know that price controls lead to shortages when that price is set below the market rate. This has happened repeatedly throughout our own history here. In fact, it happened during a Republican presidential administration. Richard Nixon had tried to impose price controls on things such as meat, basic groceries. Guess what? We ended up with shortages. And so those price controls did not last long. Well, now 50 plus years later, we're going to try this again. Well, we know it fails. Number two, her rationale is based on a false premise. She continues to insist, people on the left in general, insisting that grocery stores, the food industry are gouging people. Well, yeah, we know that prices are up, but guess what? It's not because companies are hiking prices disproportionately to their own cost rising. If you look over time, over the last 4 years, you'll actually notice that producer prices, the prices that the producers pay, have risen faster than the prices that we as consumers pay. What that means is that they're absorbing some of these price hikes through the economy. If you look at the grocery industry in particular, so this is what she's targeting,
Yeah.
the profit margins have shrunk to around $1.50 on every $100 worth of goods. Kroger, one of the biggest grocers, Kroger's is actually has smaller profit margins now than they did a decade ago. So there just is not evidence that these grocers are so-called gouging or increasing their profit margins. But yet, hey, she could still implement this, and well, we'll end up with shortages. This is basic laws of economics.
Yeah, and this is what we saw in Venezuela. We've seen this in Cuba. We've seen this in socialist countries. And you're right; it absolutely is. It's horrendous to the economy in general, and it hurts the average individuals who just want to go out and buy some food. Hey, listen, we have some viewers right now who are watching this, and they have some questions for you. If you don't mind, I'm going to put one of these up here. If Cameron can throw that up here. This is from the engineer. He says the Harris campaign uses the terms tax credit and tax deductions interchangeably. They're not. They're not. Could your guest explain the difference? They're not. They're not the same. What's the difference between tax deductions and tax credit?
So a tax deduction reduces the amount of taxable income that you have, and that can reduce your total tax bill. For instance, you get to have a tax deduction for putting money into your retirement account. Let's say you have $100,000 worth of taxable income, you save $6,000 for retirement. Well, that means that for that year, you're only going to be taxed on the $94,000 instead of the full $100,000. If you're in a 20% tax bracket, you save 20% on the $6,000 reduction. There you go. You get a $1,200 tax cut. A tax credit is far different because a tax credit is a dollar for dollar reduction in the tax in what you owe. If there's a child tax credit of $1,000 and you owe, let's say you owe $5,000 in taxes and you get a child tax credit of $1,000, your tax bill goes down dollar for dollar to $4,000. And that's where the danger of tax credits is. Tax credits can very easily really become a euphemism for welfare if you're not careful.
Right. Another
Because
way
what happens is you end up with refundable tax credits, which means that even if you have zero tax liability and the government says, oh, you get a $1,000 tax credit, even though you don't have any taxes from which to deduct that $1,000 from, you end up with $1,000 in your pocket.
in your pocket. All right. So this is basically another way for taxpayers to help other people. You're right. It's welfare. That's a very good question. I want to thank the engineer for that. Thanks for answering. That was a great answer. We have another question as well. Cameron's going to put that up on the screen here. This is from, I cannot pronounce this name, JJM and whatever it is. How is this different than property tax, which our homes are taxed at what they are worth now, not when we bought the house? So he's referring to the unrealized gains.
Yeah, there's actually very little difference. That's really the crux of the problem here. Look, property taxes. Look, your local government certainly has the power to levy those. Once again, not to wade too far into the weeds on the Constitution, but remember, there's a clause in the Constitution that says all powers not given to the federal government are retained by the people, and that's extensive tax power. So your local government, they have the power to tax your home, to tax your vehicle. A lot of those taxes are dangerous. I would love to actually see us eliminate those property taxes over time in many instances, but no doubt the local government has the power to do so. You go back to the Constitution, there is no power to tax your property value worth. The government can only tax the income itself once it is realized, once the transaction actually occurs. When you start taxing unrealized gains, there's virtually no difference between that and taxing the value of the property itself.
Yeah, and this is one of the things I hear from people who have retired and they've owned their house for 40, 50 years. It's paid off, but they still have these rising tax rates, property taxes on their homes, and they can't figure out why. They bought it 40 years ago. That was the price back then. They still get taxed on it. Thanks for that. That was good. Listen, I know you wrote about, and you've talked about tariffs, and Donald Trump is big on these tariffs. He wants to do like 10%, I believe. And John Deere is the latest kind of news item to come out as it relates to tariffs. John Deere, the tractor company, they've announced a plan to move some of its production to Mexico. and they're talking about efficiency and kind of the cheaper global labor that the advantage of doing that is key reasons for wanting to move to Mexico. But Donald Trump wants to hit them with a 200% tariff. Can you talk about that? And then on the general view from your perspective of tariffs in general, are they good or are they harmful to the American economy?
Look, trying to micromanage a company with a John Deere or otherwise, it's very dangerous. In effect, what this would do is ultimately you end up raising prices on people here in the United States by doing that, including by farmers, because they would see the equipment costs rise. And number two, you got to remember companies like John Deere or other manufacturers. This is a world marketplace that they're competing with. If we make it more difficult for them to produce here or elsewhere, that's going to mean it's going to be more difficult for them to compete on the world stage. There's so much that is said that is just not so about international trade, and I think it's important because it impacts all of us directly. If you look at the tariffs that were put in place by President Trump during his administration that were continued by President Joe Biden, those are costing American families on average several $100s each per year. And if you impose tariffs universally on all products, including 60% tariff on China, you're talking about for standard families, this could add $2,000 plus annually in living costs. This would be an enormous tax hike on the American people. It would result in hundreds of thousands of job losses if these are actually universally applied. And look, we are still right now, we're manufacturing near an all-time high. Our manufacturing soared after we entered the free trade agreement with Mexico and Canada back in the 90s. We actually saw our manufacturing expand when we extended when China entered the World Trade Organization. We actually saw our manufacturing output expand yet again. And of course, we went through quite a bit of a dip, going through some history here back in the early 2000s. But what was really interesting is when we saw our manufacturing employment actually increase steadily from around 2009 all the way until mid 2019. We saw about 10%. We saw about a 10% increase in the total number of manufacturing employees. Well, what happened right around that time in 2019? That's when we started seeing this country put in place tariffs on our trading partners. Manufacturing jobs actually began to stall out before the COVID pandemic, right around that time. So, it's a misnomer to think that our manufacturing sector is harmed by trade. No, in fact, we have produced more in the years that followed international trade. And then second of all, look, if you put in place tariffs on specific sectors, you might benefit that particular sector or a particular business in it, I should say. Think about the steel tariffs. Yes, that were put in place during the Trump era. Yes, there were a few specific companies that benefited, but the steel market overall actually lost jobs as a result. Manufacturing centers that rely on steel actually lost jobs as a result of those tariffs. So anytime you see a politician, doesn't matter if Republican or Democrat, talking about protecting this person or that person, at times a specific person or company might be spared or might be helped. But that's a tax on all of us. I was looking at some data the other day that suggested that if you look at the costs of the recent tariffs that were imposed, divided by the number of jobs so-called saved in that particular business, you're talking about $800,000 of a tax on the American people, $800,000 tax per so-called job saved. And we know that we end up with a net total job losses. And I don't want to belabor this too much, but the thing is with this is politicians are always able to point to the one person that was helped. But oftentimes, those 5 or 6 people that were harmed as a result, they remain nameless. They remained anonymous, but they're harmed as well. And that's what I'm fearful for going forward, is if we were to actually levy these tariffs on our trading partners, this is a very real harm to American families at a time when they're already reeling from Bidenomics.
Well, let me ask you this, and I want to one more question regarding this. Kind of what the Trump policies in terms of economics back when he was in office, and then I want to get more into this kind of U.S. Steel recent news that came out, and kind of Joe Biden's I guess, approach to that. But when it comes to like, you look back to Donald Trump's presidency, and there's no question that the economy was just took an uptick. I mean, it was thriving under that, and that was despite all these claims that manufacturing or drilling for oil that was behind us now. We can't do all these things, but we saw dramatic decreases in unemployment in this country, increase in wages. All these different factors that led to a very strong economy. What was it, in your view? What was, I guess, the most important thing that Donald Trump did during his presidency that allowed that economic climate to once again return to the United States?
I think one of the most positive aspects of the Trump administration was the breather on new regulations. Taxes, of course, are a burden on businesses. They're a burden on all of us, but the regulations can actually be more strangling than the taxation. We have hundreds of thousands of pages of federal code. You mean think we have the legislation that's passed by Congress is just a tiny piece of what businesses deal with, because those pieces of legislation enable hundreds of agencies to write the actual rules. In effect, you have hundreds of agencies acting as mini Congresses, and it's run amok for decades. During the Trump administration, we saw a dramatic slowdown of those new regulations, and we even saw some dangerous regulations rolled back. And I think probably most importantly on the regulatory side is former President Trump immediately pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords, for instance, almost from day one of the presidency. And those Paris Climate Accords were committing our country, basically moving full throttle on a Green New Deal that would add tens of thousands of dollars of energy costs per family over a decade. And we pulled out of that. And that's just one small example of the way in which businesses are given the green light to actually produce.
Yeah, it's called incentivizing businesses to produce, and that's what happened back then. It was wonderful at the time, and I hope we can return to that kind of mentality in the federal government. So this U.S. Steel decision, this was big news. You wrote about it, and this was in December of 2023 when the Japanese steelmaker Nippon agreed to acquire U.S. Steel, and that would be a 40% premium to shareholders. Sounded like a good deal, but Joe Biden quickly stepped in, the president of the United States, and he was pushing for a national security investigation to block this deal so that it wouldn't go through. Instead of, I guess, welcoming what would have been much needed, foreign investment from, Japan is a pretty well trusted ally nowadays. So they do this. Why do you think political figures like Joe Biden were so eager to step in, block this deal that would bring capital and jobs into the United States? What was your general feeling about this whole scenario?
Well, it's twofold. There's some opposition to this based on the fact that there's a number of union leaders, I should say, that don't want this deal to happen. And number two, look, the name itself, U.S. Steel in the past was a top company. When U.S. Steel had its IPO to be publicly traded more than 100 years ago, it was in the top 10 of U.S. companies in terms of size of the company to economic output. Today, it's, I think, 684th. It's actually quite small, but it still has that moniker. And there's also this notion, I think this false notion that politicians are sadly not countering, that if U.S. Steel gets bought up by a Japanese acquirer, that for some reason these jobs are going to disappear. Furthest thing from the truth. If you listen to the executives read the proposal from Nippon Steel, they're actually saying they're trying to buy these U.S. plants because they want to expand the production. They want to upgrade the facilities. They want to invest billions of dollars of new technology so that these firms can actually be more competitive. Japan has some of the most efficient steel production, actually the most efficient steel production, I believe, in the world with some of their technology. They're promising to infuse these companies with that capital so they can actually expand. What's going on here behind, actually not even behind the scenes, is pretty public at this point, is there's a U.S. company that wants to buy up U.S. Steel, and they want a big discount. They want, I believe, a 30% discount. It would be, you think about that. There's billions of dollars at stake here.
Right.
To your point with Japan, of course, is one of our most important allies. We have a number of trade agreements and security agreements with them. And importantly, the last thing we should be wanting to do is deterring investment dollars from Japan. Over the last 5 years or so, Japan has brought in $289 billion into this country to create jobs here. The investment dollars that Japan has actually put in the United States the last several years has been $8,000 per U.S. family. We've all benefited from this. Blocking this deal would be a big red flag, both to Japan and other countries, that perhaps this isn't the best place to invest.
Yeah, if only they were more vigorous in stopping some of these Chinese deals rather than incentivizing them. We got a big plant in Michigan called Goshen that the federal government, Joe Biden, and the Democrats really want them to put up shop here, and they're a huge national security risk. But you're right. I mean, I think the Japanese, just the automakers themselves, employ about 100,000 U.S. workers just based in their automobile plants in this country. So yeah, they're a trusted ally. They're good for this country. So that's to that point, because we hear this a lot. And then I'll follow up with one question after this, and I'll let you go. But the unions in this country, and this seems to be the genesis of why Joe Biden stopped this deal. The unions in this country have put out messaging and this narrative that workers who work for unions are the only true workers in this country. And what is your thought about what are the union dominance? And I've talked to many union leaders say, we just want to continually grow our power state by state and across this country. They want more and more power, and they want more union dues, and their tentacles all throughout the political system here. And they're donating to certain campaigns, to certain candidates, of course, which makes it very difficult. So what is happening with these union companies, whether it's the UAW or the Teamsters or whoever it is, that come in here and make the claim that only true workers are the workers that are unionized? What's your thought about them?
If the only true workers are union workers, that means 90% plus of us are somehow not true workers, number one. But look, these union bosses have failed to actually advance the interests of their members for many years. And in many states, for a long time, you didn't have a choice. You'd have to join that union if there was one on site, and you had to pay union dues whether or not you wanted to do so. And they ended up decimating a number of communities across even my home state of Ohio, and of course Michigan. The way that they were trying to interact with management and squeezing out more and more from these companies when it was very clear that the profit margins just weren't there. A lot of these factories shut down as a result. And what's very interesting is if you look at other parts of our country where they have what's called right to work, I know you're familiar with that.
Yes.
You have a lot more independent worker freedom to negotiate your contracts, to choose whether or not to be part of the union, to choose whether or not to pay these union dues. We have actually seen a renaissance in manufacturing, including the automobile sector. Go to places like South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama. There's a lot of new auto facilities, and they're very good paying jobs. And I thankfully, the word is getting out to regular workers that getting these unions on site might not actually be helping you. It's a big part of the reason why Volkswagen, I believe in Tennessee, multiple times now has rejected unionization, because the word is out. Unionize at your own risk.
Yeah.
And these union groups too. It's a big part of the reason why we are not as competitive as we could be in exporting and manufacturing. I mean, look at our docks. Obviously, to export from here to a place like China or Thailand or Japan, you got to do it by boat, right? You can't drive. A lot of these dock workers, the big union bosses, they're refusing to allow automation. For instance, they're refusing to have a 24/7 schedule. It's making us less competitive. And until we recognize that, we're never going to be as competitive on the manufacturing side as we could be.
You're right. And you're just talking about the productivity of these kind of union represented companies and whatnot. But the control that unions have over their individual employees is quite severe. And I've experienced it myself. I was a part of 2 unions. Going as far as to intervening in my own personal medical decisions in terms of procedures I needed to have that were not blocked by the insurance company, not blocked by my employer, but come to find out, the insurance company approved these things, but I found the union stepped in and said, no, we don't want you to have that procedure. We don't think you need it. And I thought, this is amazing that they have this kind of authority and that kind of power, not to mention the intimidation from your union colleagues and union stewards who behind the scenes, the way it works a lot of there's some good. I'm not saying that, but right to work is so important. You should have the option, whether or not as a worker you want to actually join that union, which will have tremendous control over your work life. Plus, you got to pay them a pretty hefty fee. One final question. I'll let you go, Joel. Thank you. The bottom line here, as we're going into this presidential election, we look at the economic policies of Kamala Harris, which I tend to think they're more socialist than anything else, and the free market policies of Donald Trump. What are the ramifications depending on the outcome of this election?
Look, I think it's important that no matter who is president, that we encourage them to adhere as closely as possible to free market principles. Lower taxes is only part of the equation here. It's very important part of the equation. Lower taxes on investment and income. But we have two other components here of growth that we need. We need to encourage international investment in this country. Sadly, both candidates seem to be throwing up a blockade on that when it comes to Japan, which is an ally. And we need to have free trade so that we can be more productive. And unfortunately, leaders in both political parties, a lot of them are going the wrong direction on that as well. But another big important component of long-term prosperity is fiscal sanity. And right now, we know we're spending far beyond our means. We're already close to $400,000 per family in debt. If you look at our federal budget, we're borrowing more every year. We're spending more on interest than on our national defense. We're spending about $25,000 a family a year, borrowing $25,000 per family of four per year. We're spending $12,000 per family of four on our national interest. This isn't sustainable. And to get this under control, we have to actually address the long-term cost drivers, such as Social Security and the entitlement programs long-term. Neither candidate seems to want to do that. So, look, I wish I had a lot more good news, but it's a difficult times right now. And I'll tell you what, though, the socialist policies that are being proposed by the far left in terms of price controls, higher taxes, a Green New Deal, those are very, very destructive, and they're being very open about their end goals. So I think it's important we recognize, the negatives of either candidate, but also recognize that, wow, what's being proposed by the far left on our economy, on energy, taxation, regulation, incredibly destructive.
It will hurt the average person, and the cost of living for the average person will go up. Your earnings will go down, and it'll be equitable, but we'll all be equally poor in this country is the way I view it. So nice to have you. Joel Griffith is a research fellow in the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation, a great organization, the Heritage Foundation. And Joel, I love your stuff. Where can people read your columns and things you write? Because I had a great time reading through your information.
Go to heritage.org. And I wanted to do a quick plug out to our new inflation calculator. Go to calculators.heritage.org. In 5 minutes, you can get a very good estimate by putting your personal details, how much Bidenomics has hurt you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, I'll get on there right away. Appreciate it. Joel Griffith, hope to have you back sometime soon. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks, Tom.
All right, take care. Great interview. And, listen, there's some disagreements even amongst Republicans about these tariffs. And, Donald Trump says, the revenue comes in and you'll see, hundreds of millions of dollars of new revenue. And that may be the case. And I think partially it'll incentivize companies from moving overseas and staying right here in the United States. That's one of the goals, I think, that he touts. But is it overall good for our economy? Is in the short term? Maybe the long term it works out. It's very complex. But grateful for Joel Griffith. We have a couple minutes here left because we started late this morning. But I want to see if we have any. Do we have any comments or questions, Cameron? No, okay, that's going to be it for now. Okay, I tell you what, we hope that you will subscribe to our podcast here, Tom Jordan Live. It's on YouTube, of course. Maybe that's where you're watching it now, on X, Facebook, all the main podcast platforms, Apple Podcast, on Spotify. Go on there if you could. If you just subscribe to us and you click that little notification bell, which everybody talks about, that really helps us out and helps the algorithms. And if you comment on these various platforms as well, it helps us out as well. We'll respond. We read through them, and we will get back to you. Of course, you could always go to tomjordanlive.com. You can subscribe to our newsletter. If you go to Patreon, Tom Jordan Live on Patreon, that helps us out as well. We'll provide you with some exclusive content also. Okay, until next time, God bless you. Have a great day.